Hello and welcome back to another Eduonics tutorial. In this section, we'll be going over the different tools in Photoshop, and in this video, we'll be picking up where we left off in the manipulation tools. Here, I have a photo of a very smooth, confident man looking directly at us. But it's hard to take him seriously when his pupils are suffering from a major case of red eye. Red eye is an unfortunate consequence of someone looking directly into the camera lens as the camera flash goes off. It mostly happens in environments with low lighting and with cameras that have a flash located very close to the lens. Basically, the flash is bouncing off his retinas to reflect right back into the lens, resulting in these eerie red pupils. Fortunately, Photoshop provides a very fast and easy way to fix this. The first manipulation tool we'll be going over in this video is one of the easiest to use in Photoshop. So let's go to the Tools panel, right-click the Healing Flyout menu, and select the Red Eye tool. And now, all we have to do is click somewhere in the redness of these eyes. Here's one, and here's two. Much better. There's a photo I can take a little more seriously. Still, there's another thing that's bugging me about this photo. This man has some good facial hair, but it's looking a little patchy in some areas. To help fix this, I'm going to go to my next manipulation tool, the Clone Stamp tool. Back in the Tools panel, we're going to skip past our brush tools, since we'll cover them in another video, and go straight to our Clone Stamp tool. The Clone Stamp tool functions a lot like the Healing Brush tool, but without any automated features. Instead, the Clone Stamp tool produces an exact duplicate of what you've sampled. So, in order to fill these empty patches without hair, I'm going to press and hold the Alt key on my keyboard and click on a bearded area to set my sample. When I'm done setting my sample, I'll release my Alt key. Now, as I hover the Clone Stamp tool around, you can see that my cursor is now an exact duplicate of what I sampled. So, using the area that I sampled, I'll go in and brush in these patchy areas. But remember, my sample point is coming from an exact copy of the entire image. So if I go too far with it, I'll get back to the patchy area I wanted to remove in the first place. So what if we want to sample a specific area as a repeating pattern instead? This leads us to our next tool. Right-click the Clone Stamp tool to get to the Pattern Stamp tool. The Pattern Stamp tool takes one of your existing saved patterns and allows you to paint it in. If we pay attention to our tool options on top, it shows us the pattern that we're currently sampling from. And in the Pattern Picker, there's a whole list of other patterns available by default. I want to pattern part of his beard. And there are no patterns here that look anything like a beard. So what I'm going to have to do is make my own pattern. I'm going to go over back to the Tools panel and click my Rectangular Marquee tool. Then draw a selection around part of his beard. This area looks pretty good. To save it as a pattern, I'll go up to Edit, Define Pattern. I'll name this Beard and click OK. Before I proceed, I don't want to be manipulating only this area, so I'll deselect by hitting Ctrl D on my keyboard. Now I'll go back to the Pattern Stamp tool, and in the tool options, I'll go to the Pattern Picker and select the new pattern that I just made. Once I have my pattern ready, I'll go over to a patchy area of his beard and just paint it in. Now, when using the Pattern Stamp tool, it's important to remember that it does not function quite like a healing tool. It is merely allowing you to use a defined pattern as a brush. If you keep brushing with it and get carried away, it's going to make the edges of the pattern very obvious, and it's not going to look natural. So using this tool in this circumstance isn't really practical unless you exercise restraint. We briefly touched on the history panel in the last video. Let's go back to it now. When we open the history panel, it shows us a list of the changes we've made since we first opened this document. The top option being the original document before we ever did anything. We already know that clicking any of these options will take us back to that history state in the document. But what if I just want to sample one of these options without completely switching to it? This is where the history brush tool comes into play. In the Tools panel, I'm going to select the History Brush tool directly below our Clone tools. Then, back in the History panel, pay attention to this icon to the left of the state of our original document. This icon represents the state that the History Brush will sample back to. I'm going to go down and click the box next to Clone Stamp, so the History Brush will sample the state before I use the Pattern Stamp tool. Now, when I brush in this area, you can see that the pattern stamp is disappearing. Now, watch what happens when I try to brush in where I used my Clone Stamp tool. Absolutely nothing changes, because my history brush isn't sampling a state before I use my Clone Stamp tool. Let's undo everything I just did by going up to the pattern stamp in the history panel. Now I'm going to select the history box for my original document before I remove the red eyes. Now when I use the history brush to brush in one of his eyes, it goes back to red. But none of my other changes are affected unless I were to brush them in as well. To once again undo what I just did, I will select Pattern Stamp above the History Brush state. As you can see, the History Brush tool and panel can be very powerful features when used together. Next up, let's right-click our History Brush tool to get to our Art History Brush tool. This one is kind of a stretch from the tools we've used so far, but stay with me. The first thing I plan to do is to fill my canvas with black. Then I can use the Art History Brush tool to paint in our image from its current state. To fill the canvas with black, I'll go up to Edit, Fill. Then under Use, I'll select Black. And then I'll hit OK. Now I'll go over to the History panel again and click the History Brush box above my current history state, Fill. So it's sampling a state in my document from where I filled it with black. Now I can hide my History panel and go over to my brush options. For this first option, I'm going to set the size to 40 pixels. And then I'll set the hardness to 80%. Then I'll go ahead and skip over to opacity and set that to 80%. For style, I want to set it to tight medium. Now I will begin brushing my main outline in a circular fashion. Nothing fancy, just setting the outline of my subject and making sure that all the gaps inside are filled, starting from the outside and spiraling inward. Then I'm going to lower the size of my brush to 30 pixels by hitting the left bracket key on my keyboard a couple of times. Once again, I will paint in, but this time I will focus where the eyes, mouth, and cigar will be. Starting with the eyes and ending with the cigar, I will repeat this process a few times, each time hitting my left bracket key once or twice and brushing the details in. as you can see, the smaller I make the brush, the more detailed the strokes appear. Finally, I will get to a very small brush which I can use to help touch up the areas that I want to draw focus. Now, you can finally see what the art history brush is capable of. It lets you very easily paint in a pre-existing image, making it seem like you've painstakingly brushed every single stroke. That will do it for this section of the manipulation tools. I will cover the final section in the next video.